Welcome to On the Edge of Breakthrough, where hope meets innovation in the fight against cancer.
Hi, I'm Dr. Monty Powell. I'm a medical oncologist at City of Hope, and I'm really excited to bring to you On the Edge of Breakthrough, Voices of Cancer Research. We're going to be bringing some of our best researchers to the table to discuss exciting findings from their laboratories, from their research programs, and really get some great perspectives on what their plans are for the future. Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to have our guest today, Dr. Saro Armenian, with us. He's the Baron Hilton Chair in Pediatrics at City of Hope. Really, we've risen through the ranks together here at the institution, wouldn't you say?
Yep.
Over a decade and a half of knowing each other. And this podcast today, I think we're going to learn new things about ourselves. So Saro's really risen to great heights in the world of pediatric oncology. Well, I think he's got a wonderful vision for pediatric oncology at City of Hope moving forward. But before we get into that, and this is actually something that we haven't chatted about through these many years of working together, I never really asked you what kind of got you into cancer research.
Thanks, Monty. It's a real thrill to be here with you. So when I think about my decision to pursue pediatric oncology and take care of children with cancer, I think about my childhood, and I think about my childhood experiences that have shaped me into who I am today. I didn't for a minute think that I was going to be a pediatric oncologist when I was growing up. It wasn't until sort of my early teens where my family really came to an existential crisis, which was essentially my sister was diagnosed with a very difficult to treat leukemia. It's called T-cell acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And that fundamentally transformed our relationship. It meant for my sister and the devastating setbacks that she had, multiple relapses, it changed my perception of the world. It changed my perception and understanding of the relationship and the power of the relationship of people around you. And we were very fortunate enough to be surrounded by people who understood us as a family. We were also surrounded by people who never gave up, who never lost hope, who channeled that same enthusiasm for a brighter future every single day, no matter how bad the odds were. And that gave my family the hope that they needed. And ultimately, when my sister succumbed to her illness, after many years of fighting so hard, it took some time for me to process and to heal. And it took some time for my parents to process and to heal. But what I kept reflecting on was the power of the relationships that we were surrounded by and the freedom that gave my sister to thrive during her worst days. And so when I ultimately came time to deciding what I wanted to do, I wanted to be a part of that narrative. I didn't want that narrative to be in the past. I wanted that narrative to be a part of my future. I wanted to help others. I wanted to give hope every single day that I walked in. And today, when a child and a family walks in the front door with a new diagnosis of cancer and I see them, the first words that come out of my mouth are words of hope. Hope for a better day. Because ultimately, there's only so much we can control. All we can control in our world is working our hardest to preserve the family, to save the life of the child, to give them the longest life that they deserve. We can be the best physicians, the best human beings. That we can control. The outcome, sometimes we can't. But to live in a world where on a day-to-day basis, you are fighting for a better tomorrow, a tomorrow full of hope, there's no better job in the world. And that's what drove me to pediatric oncology, and that's what gets me excited every single day, on good days and bad days, because I know that there is a brighter future that I'm fighting for. So in a lot of ways, it's my sister's legacy, it's my parents, and it's all the people who took care of her all those years. I'm essentially paying back and paying forward.
You know, I have to tell you, as we rotate through medical school, we go into that pediatric oncology ward, and emotionally, it's one of the toughest, most gripping things. Just having been through that personal experience, right? Having seen the doldrums with your sister, how did that affect you as you entered into the career?
In a lot of ways, I welcomed it. The first is knowledge acquisition, then there's the experience. But before all of that, as you start the journey, there's what you bring as a person. And in a lot of ways, I welcome those interactions and those relationships early on because I thought I was able to, at least relatively quickly, dive into the deep end and provide some solace, some level of empathy that would then be layered with medical knowledge, but then would be layered with experience. And so I actually found those the most exhilarating conversations and experiences during training. And in a lot of ways, I got to celebrate even more with those victories. And when there were those challenges where children were unfortunately succumbed to their illness, I was able to comfort the families and be there and understand and share with them their, the needs and address those needs in real time. So I actually welcome those experiences. And to this day, I find those relationships with my patients and their families the most rewarding of my professional career.
Well, I mean, I have to tell you, just from personal experiences working with you, you've been just so incredibly helpful with friends, family, and you're never hesitating to pick up the phone under these difficult circumstances. I want to pivot a little bit, talking about your clinical work to your research. And it's one thing to go into pediatric oncology, but what made you say to yourself, I'm going to focus on really how to advance the field?
Those were not overnight decisions. Very few of us have a direct line of sight about what we are going to be doing 10 or 15 years after we choose a specific path. For me, what I knew what was going to keep me engaged in the work that I was doing was being in an environment where asking questions was a fundamental part of what I was doing every day. I also think that it was such an important aspect of motivating the team and coalescing the team when you're continuing to be needing to reinforce what the North Star is, what the goals are. So what led me to the work that I'm doing was this quest to answer the questions that have not been answered and ultimately to improve the lives of our patients because we have the work that we do. As a pediatric oncologist, that's my clinical job, but my research is really focused on on understanding how to prevent the complications of therapy from happening so that people can live their fullest life. It was several years into my faculty appointment here at City of Hope when I finally was able to reconnect with the oncologist who took care of my sister. And I was very nervous at first, and I went up to him, and I hadn't seen him probably in over 30 years. And I wanted to tell him how much of an impact he had, how much of an influence he had on my life, how much my family still thinks of him. And he gave me this big warm hug. He remembered my sister decades later, and it was one of the most memorable exchanges that I had. And I left that meeting feeling incredibly fulfilled about the decision that I made to pursue oncology, because it was in a lot of ways, it was continuing that legacy that he had started. And it wasn't until, a few days later when he sent me an email, and in it, he actually said, I'm so glad we connected. You didn't ask the details of what happened to your sister, but I want you to know that considering what you have chosen for your career and your research, which is survivorship and optimizing the health of our patients, I want you to know that your sister, in fact, didn't die from her cancer. In fact, she succumbed to a complication of the cancer, a preventable complication of that cancer. And that really struck me. It struck me because somehow, in a very indirect way, I had pursued an area of research where I was doing just that, preventing these devastating consequences, complications of therapy. So in a lot of ways, her legacy, my mission, is very much shaped by the past. It continues to be reinforced by the present. And it continues to be infused with the energy of the future.
Well, I think you've done a really remarkable job of it. I mean, over the years, I think you've really become a household name in a field that maybe our audience isn't so familiar with, called cardio-oncology, right? It's this fusion of cardiology and oncology. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how you first sort of emerged into that space?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to take off my pediatric oncology hat now, because the majority of what I do, the work that I do, really focus across all age groups of individuals diagnosed with cancer. So if we think of cancer as the hallmark disease of aging, The other disease that you see is cardiovascular disease. So all of us, if we're going to live long enough, we're either going to develop some form of a cancer or a cardiovascular disease, most likely. What we started to recognize about 20 years ago is that these cancer patients, once they survive their cancer treatment, have a much higher risk of developing aging-related conditions. That's driven by the cancer treatment, the experience itself. It's just almost like an accelerated aging type picture that we saw, specifically in patients who were treated with very intensive therapies like bone marrow transplant. And so I was very interested in understanding the intersection between cardiovascular disease and cancer and where the two meet, because there was some amazing work that was being done in the cardiovascular world and amazing work that was being done in the cancer world. But the reality is that there wasn't much crosstalk, and there were patients with cancer or who were survivors of cancer who were developing cardiovascular issues like heart failure, heart attacks, strokes at a much higher rate than what you would expect for the general population. What's even worse was that once a cancer survivor had, they've survived their cancer, had developed cardiovascular issue like heart failure, stroke, etc., their survival rates from that condition was much worse than their peers. So it made me think, well, wait a minute, what's the point of curing these individuals when they're going to succumb to all the complications of therapy, etc.? And that really drove my initial work in the cardio-oncology world. And now cardio-oncology has become a term, and it's in fact become a discipline. There's a journal and there's meetings around that particular field. So it's really blossomed in part because of the broader oncology and cardiology community's recognition.
Yeah, it's amazing
of the importance
to me.
of this issue.
When we started out together at City of Hope, close to 20 years ago, I'd say it was more about documenting the problem, right? Really assessing what the scope of cardiotoxicity is in cancer survivors. Then that second phase for you was really, I think, quantitating the problem through perhaps more diagnostic tools. You and I did the study together looking at echocardiography. And then what I've seen more recently is this pivot towards interventions to actually fix it. So, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks so much for asking that. First step is to say, is this problem relevant for everybody? Or is it a specific subgroup or a high-risk individual? What is the nature of the problem? When does it develop? And what are the outcomes after you develop that problem? Just understanding, getting your hand. And that really is the first step, which is the observational work that you need to do. And we typically do it in large cohorts and large numbers of individuals. The next step is really to say why. What is the mechanism by which it's happening? What's the biology behind it? Because understanding the biology, understanding the mechanism, understanding the drivers of this particular issue really sets the stage for the most important step, which is ways to prevent it. And we have spent the last several years now thinking about strategies to be more proactive in preventing these devastating complications of treatment from happening. We've done it at single centers like at City of Hope, where we do specific interventions, or we've done it at multiple centers in studies led by City of Hope, by myself and others, doing large randomized trials where we can actually look at different early prevention approaches to reduce the risk of these complications from happening. And that really takes the full circle. You go from identifying the problem, who's at risk, why is it happening, and then ultimately you don't stop there, because if you stop there, that's the biggest injustice as far as I'm concerned. You really have to think about what next. How do you prevent it from happening? And that's where we've really put a lot of our efforts right now, is prevention.
I came across some of your recent papers around using carvedilol and other approaches to mitigate that risk. If you were to sort of picture a futurescape, are we going to be doing a lot of these cardiovascular interventions early in patients that we anticipate are going to be survivors?
Yeah, we're tackling these problems on multiple fronts. There are some things that we can do during the cancer treatment to minimize the risk of cardiovascular issues like therapy-related heart failure. And that has to do with using medications like cardioprotectants, which are a group of agents which essentially protect the heart, but does not sort of impact the efficacy of the anti-cancer treatment. So a classic drug would be, let's say, dexrazoxane, which is a medication that we studied in large numbers of survivors to look at its cardioprotective effects. And we showed, in fact, that the use of this drug during the cancer treatment actually helped protect the heart from the injury of the chemotherapy, but did not take away the effectiveness of the chemotherapy, which is really, really great. And now that drug has become the standard of care for how we treat children who are going to receive high doses of this chemotherapy that can affect the drug. And that was out of research that came out of here and other collaborations that we have across. So that's during the cancer treatment. Well, what if you go through your cancer treatment and you have not received that cardioprotectant? Then can we think about a paradigm of healing the heart, helping the heart recover from the injury of the chemotherapy? And that really led to the design of this carvedilol trial, which was a randomized placebo-controlled trial using low-dose carvedilol, which is a beta blocker, which is a common the generic available blood pressure medication at a very low dose to see if we can use that to help heal the heart. Now, it's a paradigm that's akin to, let's say, baby aspirin. So in the general population, for certain high-risk subgroups, they recommend baby aspirin to prevent heart attacks, etc. Not because they have disease, it's for prevention. Here, we want to use a similar approach. We know who's at high risk. So why don't we use a low dose of a medication that is safe, well tolerated to help prevent a problem? And we did that, and we actually enrolled, nearly 200 patients on this randomized placebo-controlled trial. There were over 80 institutions around the country that participated in this study. And ultimately, the results were published in Lancet Oncology and then subsequently in JACC Cardio-Oncology, where we showed that, in fact, for certain subgroups of patients, this is a very beneficial drug and a very beneficial approach.
I wanted to talk about CHIP. Now, CHIP is something that may not be necessarily familiar to everyone in our audience. So if you could tell us a little bit about CHIP and how that's really sort of playing into some of your current research approaches.
CHIP is a term that stands for clonal hematopoiesis of indeterminate potential. So let's just call it CHIP for now. So this goes back to what we talked about earlier about the intersection between cancer and aging and cardiovascular disease. So if we think that cancer, the experience and its treatment accelerates some aspects of the aging process, it would be ideal for us to look at specific markers that we can use to detect what someone's biologic age is, not what their chronologic age is in terms of where they were based on their date of birth, but their true biologic age is. And until now, we've had a really hard time identifying that because, if you can identify it early on, you can target, you can screen, you can do risk-based management, etc. A few years ago, in the general population, this concept of CHIP came out, which is all of us, as we get older, develop these, what we call somatic mutations. They're essentially these genetic changes that happen in our blood as part of the stem cell renewal process. For many of us, they don't mean anything. They just circulate around. And then the prevalence of these things start increasing. So by the time you're in your 70s and your 80s, about 10% of your cells will have some of these mutations. When we looked at our cancer patients and our cancer survivors, what we saw, in fact, that the prevalence of these circulating cells in the context of remission were nearly 2 to 3 times higher than what you would expect for the general population. In the general population, when you have these circulating cells, you're at much higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease and other aging-related issues. So we put 2 and 2 together. We said, well, wait a minute. If cancer patients have a higher risk of aging conditions and cancer patients have a higher risk of these CHIP mutations, can we see whether or not these CHIP mutations are associated with the cardiovascular issues that we're talking about? And lo and behold, we actually saw that these circulating CHIP mutations, in fact, were associated with a much higher risk of cardiovascular disease in cancer survivors. And that gave us some insight into biology, that maybe there are some blood biomarkers and measures that you can actually use to quantify the biologic aging process of a patient and ultimately deliver specific interventions to focus on that aging process.
See, I think this is brilliant because as a solid tumor oncologist focused on kidney cancer, I get blood-based DNA reports on my patients all the time. A lot of my colleagues do as well. And we don't really know what to do with that CHIP piece of it, as you've described, right? Because as the name implies, the IP stands for indeterminate potential. So I love the fact that there's some sort of science behind this. And I think one of the new things that City of Hope is bringing to the table, and I'm going to see if I can get a sneak peek of this from you here today, is a CHIP clinic, a clinic that actually focuses on CHIP. Is that something that's sort of in process? I think it's a brilliant idea.
A CHIP clinic is what you're referring to is essentially if in patients who are in remission, you see these circulating cells that may be associated with a higher risk of issues developing later on, can you be more proactive in the clinical setting in a clinical setting, as opposed to letting him go out into the community essentially and be lost outside the sort of the oversight of our clinics and our programs. I would say that the time for that is in the near future. One of the things that we've been so great about City of Hope is championing evidence-based medicine. And I would argue that if we're going to do a CHIP clinic, ultimately we would need to deliver evidence-based interventions to lower the risk of X, Y, and Z. So right now we're at the point of observation, understanding why it's happening, and now we need to develop the interventional trials based on these CHIP markers to see if you make a difference, if you intervene on it or not. So we're in the process right now of developing the first randomized clinical trials around that, where you can use this biomarker as a way to guide your different interventions. And I'm optimistic that down the line, that's going to lead the way for our establishing CHIP clinics across cancer centers.
That's amazing. Definitely very sort of forward thinking, I think, of you guys to take on that approach. The other thing I wanted to discuss here with you today is this whole concept of coronary calcification scoring, this nice and detailed assessment of the coronary arteries to assess, your risk of cardiovascular disease downstream. I mean, I think that you're quite pioneering in thinking about how to use this for patients who are cancer survivors, right? So tell us a little bit about that.
We don't want our patients, once they've gone through their cancer treatment, to fundamentally develop a life-threatening illness again. If we can find strategies for early detection and early intervention, and if we think that they're at higher risk of these issues, then what we can think about is personalized strategies to do these screening tests in this particular population. So we've looked at this in our group, looked at using coronary artery calcium as a measure for who's at higher risk than the general population. The reason why we have to think about the cancer patient and the cancer survivor differently is because their risk is different than the general population. So different screening approaches, different screening strategies have to be a part of it. So while you may not think about coronary artery calcium for everybody, but for certain high-risk individuals, I think it's really, really important. And I'll give you an example. So radiation therapy is something that we have successfully used for the treatment of many cancers. But radiation therapy has major effects on the arteries and the coronaries, especially if it's given to the chest. And in fact, patients who have radiation therapy as part of their cancer treatment need to be very closely monitored. So coronary artery calcium may be one way in which you can actually monitor for plaque buildup and actually set the stage for early interventions like lowering cholesterol, better blood sugar control, and blood pressure management, et cetera.
Yeah, I'm going to shift gears for a second. And I wanted to talk about, a lot of the happenings here at City of Hope. And we've really been sort of expanding our reach with sites in Chicago and Atlanta, Phoenix, multiple network sites here within Southern California, including our new hospital in Irvine. How does this kind of help your research mission in pediatric oncology?
One of the many things that I love about City of Hope is this yes, can do attitude and the ability of our leadership to recruit people who are open-minded about exploring new areas and new collaborations that they otherwise wouldn't. I've been so excited about the infusion of new energy. And it's not just a linear focus about one area. It's multiple areas that if you have a good question and you want to find a good collaborator, the doors are wide open for that. And in a lot of ways, I actually look at as our expansion as not necessarily a dilution, in fact, an enrichment of like-minded individuals who have a common goal, which is to work together to solve some of our most difficult challenges. And I have found that with new hires and expansion, there have been new opportunities for collaboration, and people are drawn to that spirit. And as long as you have that pioneering, excited approach to the practice of medicine, you're going to attract the right scientists and physicians. And that makes my life as a researcher so much more exciting. And it gives me so much hope for what we can do here at City of Hope.
I have to tell you, I have the exact same perspective as you. If I can editorialize for a second, I think we've always been good at collaborating externally, right? But I think now with these massive arrays of internal partners, our potential has expanded multifold. So
100% agree with you. What's excited is that we're surrounding ourselves by people who have committed to the mission of helping others, okay? Where helping others is the floor. That's your day one sort of step. You're starting your job with helping others. And then the ceiling is infinite. in terms of not just helping people in Duarte, but going beyond, establishing national standards of care as you have, fundamentally transforming the history of oncology, which City of Hope has time and time done again. That ceiling is what keeps me excited. I'm sure it keeps you excited, because that limitless opportunity, that kind of a job, that kind of a place, it's really rare to find.
I couldn't agree with you more. Maybe share with us some of the folks here at City of Hope that have been particularly influential to you in your career path.
Not sure where to begin, except to maybe say I'll just highlight a few individuals, recognizing that there are so many others who have shaped this story over the last 16 years. So I first came here because I wanted to work with one of the world's experts in the area of survivorship, and that was Dr. Smita Bhatia, who really took the lead in not just paving the way through example, but also making sure that I had all the tools that I needed, all the resources that I needed to really thrive in my first few years here at City of Hope. I got to interact with people like Steve Rosen and Steve Foreman and truly understand that mentorship just essentially is journey from one mentor to another mentor, and really understand that it's a continuing thread. Both Dr. Foreman and Dr. Rosen have opened up so many different doors, in not just for the resource standpoint, but philosophical doors in terms of how you approach patients, how you approach questions, how do you interact with others, and more importantly, how do you mentor others? And since then, with Mike Caligiuri and Marcel Vandenbrink and so many others, I always look for those opportunities of learning where I can observe and essentially learn from their years of experience. And then ultimately, I'm in a position now to be very actively engaged in mentoring the next generation of researchers and research scientists. And that has become one of the greatest privileges and thrills of my life.
So let's talk a little bit more about that end of the spectrum that you're at now, where you're in a position to bring on new faculty, be a mentor yourself. You know, as chair of Pediatric Oncology, I'm sure we'll have people listening to this podcast that say, gosh, working at City of Hope sounds great. What are you looking for in a faculty member within your department? Give us 2 or 3 key traits that would say to you, this is a person I really want to hire.
Wow, that's a great question, Monty. Intellectual curiosity has to be first and foremost. To be able to continue to ask the questions even after you've answered them, to extend into other fields and other disciplines and other paradigms. Ultimately, what we need to be doing is being at the edge, really finding where those connections are, making those connections happen and bringing them back. So those kinds of mentees really get me very excited. You can't get away from hard work. That goes without saying. And respect for others, respect for your own. Well, I guess I would say is having a true sense of humility goes a really, really long way. Understanding where your limitations are, and understanding when to ask for help, being collaborative. Those are key drivers for me. And then finally, I would say also you have to have some level of independence. At some point, you need to take the reins and actually take charge of your career, and knowing when to do that and actually feeling comfortable to do that is a big, big step forward.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm always looking for folks who have that 5 or 10-year plan ahead of them. I find that most of our faculty do. In fact, I think that a lot of them do really sort of have career goals that are set for themselves. I do feel we're entering into this very interesting time right now, right? I think there's a bit of an existential crisis in academic medicine, which is one of the other reasons that I'm so impressed at what City of Hope's been able to do. I'm just curious to know what you think our secret sauce is here. How are we kind of keeping folks who are inspired and motivated to stay in the research field like yourself?
There's a level of appreciation for good science, hard work, intellectual curiosity, and all the things that we talked about. I do think that there's a unique vibe of actually appreciating what that really means. But that said, it also requires folks like you and me to be the voices and the advocates for the continued support and investment for that attitude. Because if unchecked, I think, unfortunately, our clinical volume could overwhelm any of those aspirations. But to date, I haven't found that. I think if people have the motivation, the drive, the work ethic to actually put in the time that they need to succeed, I think they've been richly rewarded here. And I think that's what makes us different.
Yeah, I tend to agree. The other thing that's really sort of kept me at City of Hope is the opportunity to sort of branch out. Masco has been a really important outlet for me, I would say, in terms of my career development. SWOG, which is one of the NCI-funded cooperative groups. I know you've been very active in Children's Oncology Group and other forums. What sorts of endeavors outside of the institution have you found to be particularly rewarding when it comes to your career?
No person in this day and age can survive by fully relying on resources at their institution, but in terms of people, personnel, collaborators, etc. Pretty soon after you establish the area that you want to focus on, you really have to think about what is your national and what is your international community and find ways to integrate yourself into them. And it's not because the opportunities are greater. It's really because the ideas are more interesting, are more different. They're the ones who are going to continue to push your boundaries in ways that maybe at your local institution you may not, because there isn't that massive group that you can tap into that's focused on the work that you're doing. I have essentially found that community in the Children's Oncology Group. I actually, and then have expanded it to multiple international groups where now some of my closest colleagues and collaborators are around the world.
We have some interesting things that we're doing here on this podcast. And one is to pitch questions to our guests that actually come from really, I would say, high-profile investigators on campus. And one of them is one of the folks that you cited as a mentor, Steve Rosen. So, Steve has a very interesting question, which is, what would you want your legacy to be in the field? If you think about, the closing of your career, at that retirement speech, I'll be giving the speech, of course, because you'll be retiring before me. What would you want folks to say about you?
I guess, when I think about a legacy, aside from the patients and the families and the lives that were so intricately a part of what my own personal story is, if we were to purely pivot to, let's say, professional accomplishments, etc., when I first went into this field, and we call it of cancer survivorship, which is to shed light and to speak about the unique experience of having gone through a cancer treatment and to have survived it, and recognizing that these are not your everyday people. These are not your everyday heroes who are walking out and around. I would think that hopefully my legacy would be the voice that was able to speak to that experience, but not just to speak about it, but fundamentally be a player in how to reshape that narrative. To be an advocate. So I'm an oncologist. I try to do my best, not just thinking about the patient today, but the patient 10 years from now, 15, 20, 30 years from now. That is my life's mission, to be able to give the voice to those who don't have that voice, to speak about the unique experience of those patients. Going back to my sister's story, for the longest time, I thought that she had passed away from her leukemia as a result of her leukemia relapse, because she had multiple relapses. And it wasn't until many, many years later, in fact, a few years ago, when I found out that she had survived her cancer, but it wasn't the cancer that ultimately killed her, that it was a complication of the treatment. And so to be a voice for people like her, to be a voice for grandparents and parents, that is a greatest legacy that I could possibly imagine. Individuals should live to their fullest potential after having gone through what they have already gone through. So maybe that's what it would be.
Yeah, I have to tell you, I think survivors are sometimes a forgotten subpopulation of our patients. We see these dramatic responses to all these amazing new drugs that we have in our arsenal, and that's certainly cause for celebration. I wouldn't want to diminish that. But what I will say is that patients live on with toxicity. And there's so many consequences of therapy, physical, psychological, etc. So I've always felt fortunate to have a group like yours at City of Hope that is really sort of tackling that head on.
No, thank you.
So if you were to sort of project where the field of pediatric oncology, cardio-oncology, where it's going to be 20 years from now, what would you assume would be happening in the field at that point?
So if I were to project where we're going to go with pediatric oncology, it's a lot more precision-based approaches where you are taking the information from the tumor, from the cancer itself, and targeting your therapies accordingly, but also scaling back some of the more broad chemotherapies and the radiation, et cetera, exposures that we're actually using today. So I do think that the fundamental change in the landscape of pediatric oncology is going to be new drugs, new approaches, new targeted therapies, the use of immunotherapy, and less use of some of the toxic approaches. And ultimately, this is going to lead to a win-win because you're going to have healthier survivors living longer with less side effects. And that is going to be an amazing day when we can actually see that.
I couldn't agree with you more. We've got this oncology lore with regimens like MOP and some of the stuff that really invented the field, which led to dramatic cures for pediatric patients. How do you scale back from that? How do we tell parents of children who are facing these devastating diagnoses that there's an opportunity here to really test the water with these new therapies, but we're de-escalating?
That's a great question. And that's one of the challenges that we face, not just in pediatric oncology, but actually in some adult cancers like Hodgkin lymphoma, for example. We can find very effective drugs in patients. Typically, we evaluate them in patients who have relapse, refractory disease, et cetera. Sometimes you have these home run drugs that come along, and you have a pretty good sense that that drug is actually going to do quite well in the upfront setting. And you have to be bold enough to do those randomized trials. Thankfully, at least in pediatric oncology community, being a part of a clinical trial network is part of our DNA. So it's a little bit less of an uphill battle than in sort of maybe an adult oncology world. I think there are so many checks and balances in place that these substitutions, the de-escalation approaches are not, they're not sort of done trivially.
I think the person who maybe symbolizes this best at City of Hope is Alex Herrera, who had this terrific New England Journal paper that, sort of reshaped our thinking for how to treat Hodgkin's lymphoma relatively recently.
And that's a de-escalation. So we removed the chemotherapy drug and we replaced it with an immunotherapy. And the results are just earth-shattering. I mean, patients with advanced stage 3, stage 4 Hodgkin lymphoma, you actually made the bold step of actually replacing one drug and putting in an immunotherapy, which is less toxic, et cetera. And the results are outstanding, more than 92 to 95% cure rates on these individuals with very advanced stage disease.
It's just remarkable. What does on the edges of breakthrough mean to you?
When mentees come to me and they ask how they should approach a problem, that there's something that they want to focus on in terms of a scientific question that they want to address, I tell them that you're not going to get the answers from me. You're going to get the answers from the edges of where the science is. You're going to get it from where people are pushing the boundaries, maybe in a discipline that has nothing to do with oncology. But for you to be able to pick out what are the bold ideas that are being evaluated in different areas, new paradigms, new thoughts, new approaches, whether it's technology-based, whether it's scientific, whether or non-scientific, how do you take those paradigms and bring them into oncology to improve the lives of our patients? To me, that's the edge that we have to harness. And if we can tap into that energy, that momentum that's outside of our oncology world and somehow bring it back in to our everyday life, into our approach for problem solving, it would be a huge leap forward. And I always encourage my mentees to do that. So when you refer to the edge, that's where my mind goes.
I think that's brilliant. The answer is always somewhere on the fringes,
exactly.
Isn't it? Right? It's something that we haven't thought of yet, somewhere we haven't gone before. So of course, Saro, this is a podcast centered on breakthroughs, as we mentioned. So tell me, what do you think are some of the top breakthroughs that City of Hope is really responsible for?
A long time ago, we were essentially the pioneers in immunotherapy broadly. We didn't call it immunotherapy back then. We call it a bone marrow transplant. I do think that immunotherapy is clearly on the forefront of what we do. The other area is to have biologically informed approaches to treating cancers, to understand the disease biology, the cancer genetics, et cetera, and think about one strategy for one group of individuals and another strategy for another. One of the good things about City of Hope being such a large center is we have the opportunity with given the population to think about stratified approaches to cancer treatment. We have led the way for doing that. And I think that's fundamentally, that's going to be the sort of the paradigm moving forward. As Sam Golter said, one of our founders here at City of Hope, the idea that there's no purpose in curing the body if in the process you are hurting and damaging the soul. City of Hope has had this two-pronged approach. driving innovative approaches to curing individuals, but never letting go of the soul of what it takes to keep someone whole. So I'm so proud to be here, to be a part of a community of nurses, physicians, pharmacists, the entire spectrum of researchers, who are committed to one mission, which is combining those two worlds, which is preserving the soul while delivering the cures. That makes me so happy every day when I come to work. Whether it's the valet driver, or it's the cafeteria worker, or it's the crosswalk person who's helping us across the crosswalk, it's the remarkable story of City of Hope that continues to evolve. So you asked me, what are we good at? What are we known for? I think we're good at doing what we do amazingly well and preserving the soul of individuals as best as we can.
Saro, I'm so touched right now. You've taken us on this amazing journey today during the podcast, walking us through your origin story, how you really built a career initially on understanding the scope of cardiotoxicity and survivorship issues in pediatric oncology, and really leading us towards how we're going to be treating these issues 10 to 20 years from now. So grateful for you being our guest on the podcast today, and I certainly hope you'll join us again.
Thank you very much, Mati. It was a pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
This podcast was produced in partnership with Amaze Media Labs.